Welcome. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for ProCanna's 12th LinkedIn Live event, the Trifecta to Operational Success in the Cannabis Industry. My name is Dede Perkins. I am one of the co-founders and I'm the CEO of ProCanna, which is an intelligent tool that increases compliance and eases the pain of maintaining it across any cannabis organization. I'm very pleased to say that with me today is BriAnne Ramsay, the founder of Rocky Mountain Cannabis Consulting, also known as RMCC. Brienne is an industry veteran who oversaw and scaled a Denver-based vertically integrated cannabis operation, and she previously served as a technology compliance officer. And she's currently the owner of 2 cannabis consulting firms. Brienne is known for building stronger compliance teams with her proven launch package method, which she'll speak about, supporting technology solutions in metric API development and accelerating the growth of cannabis consultants' businesses through her online business accelerator. So for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to talk about a few things. The first is how to implement a data-driven training plan to decrease employee turnover and promote and improve standardization throughout an organization. Number 2, playbooks versus SOPs. What's the difference? Why are they important? Brienne in her travels often sees, similarities and differences between cannabis operations, but there are a few major missing operational areas that she sees consistently. So we're going to talk about that real quickly. And then we're going to talk about audits, internal audits versus third party, and why they're important. So we will save a few questions at the end. Feel free to put any questions that you have into the chat, and we will address them if we have time. And if we don't have time to answer all the questions, definitely feel free to reach out to either me or Brienne after the event. We are happy to continue the conversation offline. And now I am happy to introduce Brienne. Maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got in the cannabis industry, what inspired you to start Rocky Mountain Cannabis Consulting.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Dede and the ProCanna team for having me. It's fun being on the other end of this. Just a few months ago, you were on my podcast, Elevated Businesses. So it's kind of fun being on the other end of the table. But a little bit about me. So I actually went to school for marine biology in a landlocked state outside of Philly. And I moved to Denver, Colorado, specifically to get started in the cannabis industry in December of 2013. And I was able to get into a company. I switched from that company to another one, but that's besides the point. And I started as an entry-level position and worked my way up to an executive position where I oversaw inventory control, compliance. I was also the lead auditor for the metric auditing team, which was 5 different women in that team during that time. And I was also the company purchaser. And during that time, I was overseeing 20 different licenses. And so I was wearing a ton of hats, which we're going to dive into in this conversation, which is kind of your first red flag when it comes to operations and building out your teams. Many times the compliance positions, they're often just thrown into this role. And unfortunately, because of this high risk our industry is in, we don't have the luxury of trial and error our way through. And so that can be super challenging for compliance officers and something I'm still seeing to this day. And the main reason why I developed RMCC. After my time as in the licensed operator space, I went to go work for FlowHub as their compliance officer. And it was an incredible experience because I got to see a bird's eye view of the entire industry nationwide. And there I realized that there's this really big gap between compliance, operations, and how does your technology impact that? And so that's the main reason why I started RMCC, was to help translate those 3 areas in something that I personally refer to as compliance operations. And so the problem that I am solving is helping to expedite the implementation of a compliance operations infrastructure through RMCC, through that launch package, which is a more one-on-one partnership with me for the entire year, or through the online business accelerator, the RMCC compliance operations certification program.
That's great. And I'm sure everybody can, commiserate with wearing many hats and just being, having to jump into a situation. So you're definitely a lifeline. So I'm very glad to be talking with you today. Okay, so let's jump in. Let's start out with training. You mentioned a data-driven training plan. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's first kind of talk about the use cases that might resonate a little bit more with the people that are tuning in. So, first, from the dispensary side, we want to better understand each individual employee or bud tender. What is their average ticket transaction amount? What are the top 3 brands these employees sells? And what is the average transaction time? For brands, this might look like, what is the total purchase order amount per store? How frequently are they ordering? What is that inventory turn? And so we want to get this baseline data points or key performance indicators, KPIs. And from there, once we go in and conduct a training, we then want to reanalyze those KPIs to see how well the bud tender or the store is producing after that training. But what's even more important is your actual training and what is the data within that actual training. So to bring it back to another use case, in RMCC's online business accelerator, what we do is we have something called an aptitude test. So it's a really robust, I want to say 75 different questions. It takes you about 2 to 3 hours to get through. And it's a really in-depth assessment of your knowledge, your operations, your documentation. How do you define compliance? How do you instill that culture and teach others? And on average, students entering into the certification program, they score a 35%. So that means that on 65% of knowledge, a gap in knowledge of what it takes to run a compliant business and have that structure around that. And then at the end of the program, they then take that same aptitude test again. And on average, students score about a 75%. So that is a 40% gain in knowledge through the program. And so those are kind of some ways to start looking at your baseline and then looking at after the training, how did those individuals improve and did they actually retain that knowledge? And you can do that by implementing the exact same test before the training and after the training.
That's great. So question that came to mind, is there an ideal training schedule? I mean, obviously, if you're talking about people in the business, they've been trained, they've gone through their onboarding training. Is there sort of are there triggers to training or just on a time frame or, how does someone decide, that, yeah, they need to get after training again?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's also back up a minute and define what training is, because that's another big gap that I see is a lot of times people will just throw an SOP or a regulation at someone and be like, read this, and now you're trained. That's not a training. We need to actually measure their results. And also we need to take into account everyone learns differently. So someone might need a workflow diagram or a checklist or a mini video or something more interactive. Those are different aspects that we need to consider when we're developing a training plan. But as a rule of thumb, the first 30 to 90 days are absolutely critical. The way that you retain employees is to have a standardized and structured business. And so if you have clear direction and transparency into the operation with clear defined roles, an organizational chart, things along that nature, it makes it a lot easier for the employee to be onboarded and then dive directly into their role. So the first aspect you really should take a look at is your onboarding process. And what does that look like for new employees for their 30, 60, and 90 days? From there, we then need to take a look at our specialized roles. Inventory control versus inventory manager versus metric administrator versus a compliance officer versus an internal auditor. Look at all of those different types of roles and their unique responsibilities, and then start developing a training around that. And that training, ideally, you would want to do it every 6 months, maybe 9 months, but realistically, we all have so much on our plates. It's probably only happening on an annual basis. And so I do recommend that continue education and also look for other certification and programs out there to continue your education.
And some states require ongoing annual training and retraining. So depending on which state you're in, you may have to, comply with a certain amount of hours in any given year. So in your experience, has having a sort of an organized and well thought out training plan, does it reduce employee turnover? I know that's one of the difficulties right now that a lot of operators are facing. You're bringing people in, it's not fun, they're stressed, they leave, and the turnover is incredible.
Right. So yeah, what was it? I think banks release like a insane data point about 60% of employees leave after 90 days or something along that nature. Don't quote me exactly on those
Right,
data
right.
points, but I remember reading that and just being absolutely shocked. And in my opinion, the reason why we have such high employee turnover is because of a lack of operational structure and not investing in your team's growth through education and ongoing education. Dede, to your point, some states do require like approved vendor training, but when we look at those approved vendor training curriculums, they're only 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah.
Like you can't learn everything in 2 to 3 hours. To kind of compare to RMCC certification, the full supply chain is a 200-hour program to cover everything. Like I just, me personally, in my business strategy within RMCC, we don't do approved vendor curriculum. That's not something we have ever focused on. We will never focus on because I just don't believe it's sufficient. I think it's a great baseline, but there's a lot more that I think needs to be adapted from that. And so going back to the high turnover and the lack of operational infrastructure, some things to help solve that. So one, have clear defined roles, clear defined job descriptions, and really you as an employee, you need to learn to say no. You need to learn to put your boundaries in and when to say, no, that's outside of my job description. That's not my responsibility, because I know we're just so eager and want to get in there and problem solve. Unfortunately, when you don't put those boundaries in, then you're just asking for burnout and overwhelm, and you're just not going to enjoy your job as much. And I say that from experience. Like I definitely learned that the hard way. And that just goes to wearing too many hats and also just not having internal checks and balances within the operation. Someone's role is to do X, Y, and Z. Someone else validates that that was accurate and have an extra set of eyes on that. That's a role that I refer to as the internal auditor role, specifically to help out with not only inventory control and compliance, but also financials, and help the accounting team and make sure that all of your cost of goods, your margins are truly what you think they are in your database. And, you know, we all feel like we're putting out fires left and right. And so compliance officers, they often feel that they are reactionary and not so proactive. And so giving them more support through like an internal auditor is something to help solve that. And to kind of go back again to the training plan and just helping with employee turnover, just remember that the training plan is not just reading SOPs and regulations. Like this is a clear, defined roadmap. How do you learn it? What do you learn? What are the multiple resources on how to learn that material, and centralize that so it's easy for them to access, because again, we all learn differently. And of course, what are those measurable data points to confirm the retention of the education?
It's very helpful. And, you know, and I will say, you know, there's a lot of companies that they are brand new, right? They're startups. And, you know, I think it's easier to put in a system at the beginning, even if you don't have a different person for all the roles you mentioned, right? Know that you're working towards that. But no matter where you are in the life of your business, I think just starting to pay attention to like you said, a data-driven training plan will get you where you want to go faster than if you just put on blinders. You know, you don't have to do it perfectly right from the get-go. Just move towards the goal. Before we jump into the next section, you had talked about standardization throughout an industry, throughout an organization. What do you mean by that? So everybody's doing the consistency, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I always like to say centralize to standardize. And so this means to centralize your job descriptions and oversight of the operation with clearly defined responsibilities. Standardization can also apply to how you develop your SOPs, making sure you have a standardized template that you use every single time. So that way you're not causing confusion within the team and seeing a different setup. Or your playbooks, which I know we're going to dive into playbooks too. Again, your new employee onboarding process, your first 30, 60, 90 days should exactly be the same thing for every single employee. It's just that ongoing education for their specialized roles that I suggest that you start to develop. Also, your employee reviews. This is another like big HR thing that I see lacking in cannabis businesses, that we don't have a clear employee review schedule. So even after that first 90 days, the employee should be getting feedback. They should know what they did wrong, what they can improve on, what the expectations are within the first 90 days. Then, of course, again, annually minimum. And with that employee reviews, I think it's also, especially for salary employees, set the expectation on what the raises could be. So like, will you get a 2 to 6% raise each year? I know that's low with inflation and everything else that we have going on with the economy, but set that expectation so that way the employees know. And then their annual review and their annual salary boost is tied together. So that way we have that documentation. And again, just overall protects the business because of documentation, employment laws, things like that. And then, of course, standardization applies to data, your technology, not only from inventory control, but also your financials. If you're a brand and using a CRM, all of those things are really critical, important to centralize the data input and standardize it as much as possible.
Yeah, and that documentation is crucially important. You know, just an organized business will serve everybody. Okay, so playbooks versus plain old SOPs. Let's talk about that. We get a lot of questions. There's a lot of stress around writing SOPs if you're a new company and adapting them and sharing them, and so yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So me personally, I define SOPs and playbooks as two different types of documents. I define SOPs as something that you use for the licensing process, and usually pretty heavy in legal jargon. And you're also quoting those regulations or those statutes. And that's because you want to obtain those licenses. The regulators want to see that documentation in your SOP. And it's really easier for the regulator or the inspector reviewing your application because their mind's already in that world. But that doesn't work for your employees. If you just put meat packaging and labeling requirements 3-1000, like, do you think your employee is going to go to the regulations and then pull up the regulations and read 50 pages of regulations on packaging and labeling? Probably not. So we need to digest that. We need to put that into layman's terms. And so packaging and labeling specifically, I would create a checklist for that. I would create a checklist by each individual product type. And I would also think about how this checklist is being used. So my checklist for sending product out to the retailer might be different from the retailer intaking a shipment and adding it to their store. So think about the context of how that playbook or that job aid is being used. And in playbooks, I really love to provide multiple different examples. So my playbook specifically, they always have screenshots, but the screenshots always have like little arrows and little boxes around them to like really focus in on what I'm trying to communicate there. There's workflow diagrams, there's high-level checklists, and there's also what I call effectiveness criteria. And this is actually something for the compliance officer. This is something for the compliance officer to see, okay, 3 to 5 steps. I know these 3 to 5 things happened within the operation, so I can trust, but still need to verify that that operation or that workflow was done compliantly. A real life example that I've been working through the past few months where I have one client that had about 75 different SOP templates. So they had the framework, they had the starting material of these really great templates. But these templates, when I went to look at, okay, how do I harvest and test and package this material? Well, when I go to look at that specific workflow, that was between 8 different SOPs. So everything from like harvesting, packaging, processing, and then all the metric workflows and the record retention were completely separate SOPs, and they weren't referencing each other either. And so I was like, okay, we need to like unpack all 8 of these SOPs. We need to centralize them through one playbook. So that way, when someone goes to look at this document, they have everything that they need in that one document and don't have to go switch between different documents or don't even know where to look or miss a step. There's so many different things. And so really that foundation and that structure of how you're developing your playbooks is really critically important, and really think about the person in their jobs and what they will be doing A through Z, and helping to create a centralized document for that.
So do you think of playbooks as almost like folders of, it could have 3 SOPs in it, 8 SOPs in it, but they're groupings of activities basically that need to be together or need, interesting.
Yeah. And what I like to do as well, this kind of ties into like operational framework and having transparency into your business. I believe that every cannabis business, this is also something I've implemented into my own business, is to have something called a dashboard, but like not a dashboard in the sense of data points and KPIs and graphs, but having a full transparency of the job descriptions, of the organizational chart, of these playbooks, and really block them by job description. So all the inventory control team is going to go to this one folder, and they have everything they need. I use Google Sites because Google Sites is just like a Google Drive, but it's just more visually appealing and easier to navigate. And within those dashboards, what's nice is you can have your playbooks there. And so I like to have my playbooks there specifically because I use the table of contents feature, because some of these playbooks can be 25, 30 pages in length. And so if you're using it more virtually and not so much of a handheld SOP or printed out SOP, you can navigate through the table of contents a lot easier virtually via like Google Docs or some tool like that.
It's helpful. Okay, so we're in the interest of time. I want to keep our eye on the clock, but a couple more things. So we'll leave the auditing to the end because I think that's checking that all these initiatives that you're putting in place are working, right? But let's speak to the operational best practices, worst practices, and mistakes that you've seen, and whatever you think is most important to address there.
Yeah, absolutely. So overall, transparency. I keep on harping on job roles, defined roles, really knowing what they need to do and not to do. But some high level big mistakes that I've seen: assuming your operations manager and your compliance officer are the same position. Absolutely not. Do not do that. There will be things that fall.
They are often the same.
It's so often.
Yeah.
It's so often. And really, operations is there to help build efficiency and help the team and get product out and generate revenue. Compliance or a risk manager are there to protect the business. So two very different concepts. And of course, when you're just starting out, if you just opened up a brand new retail location in New Jersey, and let's say you're only bringing in like $5,000 a day, like I understand like those margins and that need, but you really need to consider what are those responsibilities and whose responsibilities are what, and have those checks and balances. Some other mistakes that I've seen, this is mostly more in California when they were implementing metric, but they're still doing these job descriptions, something called a metric technician. And this metric technician role is not a metric administrator. It's literally the centralized data input to input data into metric or the third-party systems. And unfortunately, because California has now been using metric for a few years, they're now finding that they have people in these metric technician roles. They completely 100% trusted them, relied on them, and then they are upset about something. They leave the company, and then they go to look at the data and realize it's a mess. And so that is another role I don't recommend. And to solve for that, I recommend the internal compliance auditor role. And so that internal compliance auditor role is someone to support the compliance officer. And they go through and do sample audits across all of the different licenses. And not only are they taking a look at inventory control, but they're looking at packaging and labeling, expired products. They're looking at record retention, manifest, invoice, COA test. They're also helping the accounting and the financial department to make sure that the data is getting plugged in correctly of cost of goods, so that way they can analyze their margins. So they're really an internal support team for across all different types of departments.
That's very helpful. Okay. Audits, internal auditors, third-party auditors. Let's talk a little bit about that, because that's how you check that your programs are working. You're right.
Yep, absolutely. And so first and foremost, just remember everyone interprets the regulations differently and the operations differently. So having those perspectives are a benefit to your business, because the more eyes on the operation, the better. And so internal audits are building a consistent audit schedule to review. So I kind of touched on this already, but like facility compliance, OSHA, or local ordinances, state requirements, looking at your taxes and your financials, manifest invoice, COAs. And this is also great to prepare for the IRS audits. So if anyone's been through an IRS audit, a lot of times they'll ask for your metric manifest and the invoices to make sure you're not diverting or inverting cannabis. So that's a really big thing to keep an eye on and to start preparing that now and to organize your record retention in an efficient manner, virtually and physically, to prepare for that. Also look at vendor accuracy. Are you up to date with what their state license? Can you confirm that the license that you're working with is not expired? Do they have a state business license? Things along that nature. So I would also recommend like a vendor audit, of course, inventory control and adjustments, packaging and labeling, and then overall just data standardization. One thing my auditing team did, my operation days, what we would do is we actually did coupon audits. So each on one of our dispensaries, we would take a look at who were the budtenders that were discounting the most, who were the managers discounting the most, and how was that impacting the margin. We had 8 different retail locations, so we would compare all of the retail locations against each other and be like, hey, you're discounting pretty heavily compared to this other state, and kind of keep people in check there. Again, just tying into margins. And then third-party auditor is generally a person who comes on site. They're usually a contractor, and they might spend a day with you. They might spend a full week with you. However, third-party auditors may also be used for litigation disputes with other licenses or state agencies.
So when you're saying a third-party auditor, is that different than, a regulator who comes in and audits your facility? Or you're talking about the cannabis operator hiring a third party to come in and basically review the operations?
Correct. Yeah, like an outside consultant.
Yep. So question on, I'm thinking some of these smaller companies, an internal auditing role. So that person is potentially identifying strengths, but also weaknesses. Does then it go back to the departments to correct any issues that they have found? And then is there a re-audit kind of best practice, or do you just wait till the next quarter? Like, what happens after you get this information, then what makes it actionable?
Yeah, a great question. So the internal auditors, because they're so deeply involved in the day-to-day operations and in the license, you should set up some sort of like audit assessment, of course, like what they're going to check, what that grading system is, and then also what those recommended next steps are to solve that. And from there, I suggest providing that to your compliance officer and letting your compliance officer review that, and then having your compliance officer talk to the facility lead. So if you're in a warehouse, go directly to that GM or operations manager, or to the store manager into the dispensary. And usually, at least what I did during my operation days and what I advise, is that internal auditor should be in each license a minimum of 2 times a month. So of course, when they go back to do that sample audit, the number one thing they're going to check is to make sure that you corrected everything that they flagged 2 weeks ago. And then from there, they're going to do another sample audit on top of that. But I do believe that there needs to be some barrier between the internal auditor and your compliance officer and how that's getting communicated to the facility managers, because it's really sensitive. Everyone wants to do their job accurately, compliantly, and efficiently. No one wants to do their job wrong. And so this can be a really emotional thing when you flag those things and then they feel, they're not superior, like, imposter syndrome. They're just having all of these feelings. And so I highly suggest having a more leadership position communicate those deficiencies and help work through that, instead of having the internal auditor just go directly to the facility and say, hey, here's your score. Here's everything you got wrong.
I think that's great advice, because you're right. And that's great. This has been really helpful. So just mindful of time, we do have a couple of questions from the audience. Anything that any last, ideas or thoughts before we jump into the Q&A section?
I don't think so. Let's go.
Okay. All right. First one. Do you have any advice for starting your own cannabis consulting company?
Oh, how fun. I love this question. So So a little bit side tip. So I did start a second company that's separate of RMCC, specifically to help cannabis consultants build and scale their consulting business. I get questions a lot of times like, how did you build RMCC? What happened? Like, what were your steps? Why? And I was like, I love entrepreneurship and people taking control of their lives. And so I feel like this is a really great avenue for people to do that. And high level, if you're like, I want to go start a consulting company right now, and from the very bottom of the barrel, of course, register your entity, make sure that you have your federal tax identification, open up a bank account. Be mindful though, it should be cannabis friendly, because even if you're not technically plant touching, there's some challenges there. So just know that. Also get a surety bond and errors and admissions insurance. That is absolutely critical. And then the next step is starting to work through your agreement and making sure that you have a really good attorney to review that agreement and you have a very clear statement of work. A lot of times statements of work can be just kind of flimsy and no clear deliverables. Don't do that. You're asking yourself for a lot of trouble. So definitely just don't do that. And then from there, you really need to start to think about what are the problems you're solving. Stay hyper focused and niche down. I highly recommend that, because I like to say it's a big enough sandbox, we can all play in it, but don't be broad. Go exactly for what works for you, what you know that you can really make a really big impact in. And when you start to think about your products and services, don't just provide a menu. Don't just be like, oh, these are all the things that I can do. Like, cannabis businesses, they don't have the time for that. They need to know what the problem is and how you're going to solve it, and what are those 3 to 5 steps to get there. They don't need to know this is 10, 15 different services bundled into one package for us to get that end result. And then from your own business standpoint, start to think about how you will be able to scale the business, because even if it's just in the beginning, when you're taking on one-on-one clients, you can only scale the business so far. You will get burned out. There will be things that happen. And when you hit that critical level of burnout, you're now putting your clients at risk. And so then you're risking your own business, because that's your reputation. So really think about, I love online products and services. I feel like it's more accessible. I can reach more people that way. So I'm a huge fan of like online courses or online digital downloads, and start thinking about that passive income revenue stream. I say passive in quotes because nothing's truly passive. It takes a lot of work.
Right. You are an incredibly hard worker. That is very helpful. So I think we have time for one more. Oh yeah, we'll get one more in. As someone who is opening a new cannabis business, what is the best team operational structure to implement?
Cool. So we've already harped on it. Operations compliance, 2 different roles. Please, please, please make sure you do that. And then also consider inventory is going to be one of your highest risks. Improper control of inventory can lead to like public safety violations, which is the worst case scenario here in Colorado. It's the #1 violation, and you could lose your license because of a public safety violation. So consider something like your inventory manager, maybe your company purchaser, and your inventory control as all different positions. And I say inventory control specifically because the inventory controller, their responsibility is to maintain the accuracy of the inventory within that license. So they're doing like the cycle counts, they're doing the adjustments. If something is severe, they're escalating that. They might also do some training within the operation, but that inventory control is just to control their inventory. They're not the inventory manager. They're not the purchaser. They're not maintaining stock levels or anything like that. And so consider that. And so those 3 roles, so again, inventory manager, company purchaser, and inventory control, there can be a little bit of overlap. But essentially, if you are bringing in any more than $250,000 in a month, then those need to be separate roles. Anything less than that, then there might be some wiggle room there to kind of overlap some things.
That's great advice. And that's also a good way of thinking about it, right? I mean, obviously you can't have, a huge staff if you're just starting. So, but again, knowing what you're working towards and sort of having those benchmarks, when we get to this much revenue, ideally our team will look like this much, so, well, thank you, Brienne. You are a wealth of information. I would encourage anybody who, thinks they need help to reach out to Brienne. She's awesome. She's wonderful to work with, and she certainly has a lot of experience. But, if you'd like to learn more about ProCanna, please visit procanna-usa.com. And if you'd like to learn any more about Brienne or Rocky Mountain Cannabis Consulting, please visit RockyMountainCannabisConsulting.com. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. This was amazing.
See ya.
Bye.